Busy week?
Yeah, a few things happening, huh, Rob?
We're super excited to be here. It's hard to know where to start. Has anybody heard that there are things going on in the Twitter sphere? You can nod. I can see you. It's been a busy week. We're super excited to be here with Luke and Bob. Obviously, two really integral folks in what's happening and what has been happening when it comes to minor decentralization, just as a core principle of what's important to the network. More recently, we've had a small seismic activity in the world of OpReturn. And we're excited to get to the root of it. So I had wonderfully prepared notes and all sorts of directions and insightful comments and witticisms, but we quickly nuked that with the advent of last week. This is an extremely rapidly evolving space and issue. Could you guys just introduce us to the core question of what the hell is going on?
All right, I'll try to start. Well, I think it starts with process. I think, what is the process of change? Bitcoin is touted as rules without rulers, but are there really rulers changing rules? And who gets a say in that? I think that's one part. I think the second part is, do we want to give users and participants in the network, like miners, more or less flexibility going forward? 3, what is the standard? What is the Bitcoin standard? You hear a lot of talk about consensus and standard. And the fourth is the issue that propagated it all, which is, where do we sit on spam within the network? I think it's a very critical moment in Bitcoin's history, but maybe it can be a good thing, because a lot of times when there's controversy, it awakens people. And so that's my hope for this, and we can drill into some of those. But there's no better guy to really expand on that than the guy next to me here, because he's lived it and breathed these sort of things for a really long time. So I think we should hear from him.
Take it away.
And there's consensus rules, but there's also policy, which is a decision that each node, each miner makes, how they create the blocks. And so the controversy in the last week or two has been revolving around nodes and how they could make blocks. Some Bitcoin core developers, not necessarily all, have been pushing to remove the options to exclude certain spam from the blocks they make. That appears to have been prompted by a company, whether it's a spammer or not. They're basically threatening to spam UTXO set if Bitcoin Core doesn't make this concession. And a lot of developers seem to be falling in line with that just because they think there's nothing they can do about it, which is also incorrect.
One thing that I have a lot of curiosity about from your perspective, Luke, is that from a historical perspective, there are very few humans on the face of the earth who have done a couple of things. One is seen the code to the degree of technical understanding that you have, while also having seen the code develop over the course of over a decade. Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience is like as somebody who has always been a very principled actor in the way that you have operated, to see this thing that you've been working on for so long? Has it changed incrementally? Has it moved towards or away from values that you've held? what kind of perspective or insights can you offer to us? Because most of us who have gotten into Bitcoin, even some of us coming up on a decade plus, will never understand Bitcoin at that sort of technical root that you have. So can you help us understand what is it like to see it change from that perspective and from that technical depth?
Well, when Satoshi started Bitcoin, you can only speculate so much about Satoshi's background, but it seems a lot as if it was kind of thrown together, not necessarily done in a well thought out way in advance. A lot of the code was initially just part of one big, large file called main. So there's been a lot of room for improvement over the last decade plus, and there has been a lot of improvement in that area. But there's also been a lot of setbacks, particularly around node policies and mining policies, where the choices that miners used to be able to make have been taken away from them.
Can you tell us a little bit how that dovetails into what you're doing with Ocean? Because this is really interesting. It's where Bob enters the picture, and you have some fantastic background in compute on your own accord with your professional background. Why has mining become this place that you've decided to now kind of reintroduce this conversation? Why it of all places in the protocol?
Mining centralization is, I would say, the second largest problem with Bitcoin today. Not only has the software removed the options for miners, but also the miners have largely removed themselves from making any decisions by having large mining pools basically take over the entire process of mining, aside from the hashing. And this is bad for Bitcoin. It centralizes the decision about what goes in the blocks. It makes Bitcoin subject to censorship very easily. There could be 51% attacks, which, despite the name, don't actually require 51% of the hash rate, and various problems of that nature. When we launched Ocean, our goal is to decentralize Bitcoin mining and solve that number 2 problem in Bitcoin. And so part of that is, first of all, making it so that the miners are the ones making the decisions. At Ocean, we don't want to be the ones making the decisions about what goes in the blocks. We want the miners to do that individually. And the other part of that, of course, is actually giving the miners options on how they can make their blocks in the first place. It doesn't make sense to move the decision-making to the miners and then give the miners no decisions they can actually make.
Bob, where do you enter the picture on this? And how do you even make the connection to begin with? You hear about this mythical creature, Luke, and you decide you have to meet him. What happens?
Well, the history of my association with Ocean started about 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, the summer of 2023. And prior to that, I had a realization that, contrary to what I think most people think about mining, I think most people, if you had to give a succinct definition of what mining is, they would say something about hashing, they would say something about producing Bitcoin and trying to earn the block reward. I think that would be the common way that people look at it. And I think that's still the pervasive attitude today. But I could see that was going to change. And I think we're kind of in an inflection period right now where this change is going to start. And that's that the role of the miner is to produce blocks and produce block space and monetize that activity. And so that's a completely different philosophical approach to how you organize your company and your strategy. And so as the CEO of Barefoot Mining, I said, well, how do I do this? Because I'm restricted by the pools. The pools are doing all these things, and I'm not participating. Fortuitously, I ran into Mechanic and Mark, president at Ocean, at a conference in the summer of 2023, as I said. And Luke had just kind of started getting this thing back together. Was it June of that year? Luke, maybe somewhere in that period, June of 2023, had just kind of started it. I think maybe I was talking to them in July. And it was music to my ears that what what was trying to be revived at that point, which was the rebirth of the Allegis pool. At the time, I don't think we had the name Ocean yet, did we? I don't think so. I don't think we had Ocean yet.
I mostly just heard about you from Mechanic and Mercs in chat, so
yeah,
I don't have the timing.
Yeah. So, but what happened was I saw a path to my vision, because what I saw was, if it's much easier for me to articulate now than it was then, but what I saw was that I wasn't mining. There was this stark realization that even though the name of my company was Barefoot Mining, I wasn't actually a miner. And it was kind of disillusioning, right? No, I'm just a hasher. And by the way, side note, there's a little tweet interaction between Marshall Long and I about the terms miner versus hasher that some of you might find interesting. But anyway, I had, I think, a 4-hour dinner with them that day. I signed up on the spot, committing, first company to commit hash rate to the project, and later on invested in the company through my fund and joined the board because not only was it the best thing for Bitcoin, but it was the best thing for my company. It was the only way I saw that I had a hope of fulfilling this vision. And to wrap that to what's happening now, my company, and now in affiliate with Ocean, we've continued down this path. Datum has been a phenomenal success and a phenomenal addition to the infrastructure. And now, for instance, like I have projects where we're trying to build further on that to create things, for instance, like a block space derivatives marketplace. And the only way for that to be embodied, for it to be fulfilled, is to have as much flexibility as possible in the template creation. Now, thank God we have knots, but we want as many choices as possible. And the last thing I'll say is that, for those who don't know me, I came from the personal computer industry. I was the chief technical officer at a company called Gateway that some of you that are older might remember. And one of the things I learned there was that giving users as many choices and as many options as possible is paramount. Like, you can't take things away. People don't want their rights and their privileges more restricted with time. They want the opposite. So this move is going contrary to that. And, as I said before, also the manner in which it's occurring really bothers me, because what I see is that, from the perspective of the team that is trying to do this merge and push this out, my voice and the voice of people like me have been irrelevant.
This is a rabbit hole. And it only gets more complicated as new entrants join the space. Luke, what does OpReturn have to do with any of this? Is the core theme to this simply this idea of user choice and responsibility, of adherence to a certain ideological vision? What's the nucleus of what we're talking about that OpReturn has sparked so many people on both sides? Why has it caused this firestorm?
The root problem is simply that OpReturn does not really have a place in Bitcoin. It was added as an alternative to try to deter some of the more harmful spam back in...
Could you give us the history on that?
Yeah, back, I forget what year, but around version 0.9, there were spammers that were flooding the UTXO set with fake transactions, essentially, that could never be spent, and it would have to be stored and kept up to date by every single node for all time because it was unspendable, and they couldn't detect it was unspendable. So OpReturn was added as a way for the spammers to flag that their spam was unspendable, as kind of a compromise, but it was explicitly not meant to be used at all. Spam was recognized as a harmful thing to Bitcoin. Like, all this stuff was explicitly stated when it was added as a thing.
And it does feel like that conversation has become one almost of semantics once it enters kind of the public square, where people say, well, what's spam? You know, how do I define it? Is it all use cases of one particular type? How can you know? And how do we define it? Is it to you a technical specification? Is it simply an adherence to the vision of the white paper? You've seen it change. Well, what are we holding to? What's your ideal of here's where we draw the line on what is and is not?
I wouldn't say it has changed. Bitcoin was created, the whole protocol was designed around this idea of sending Bitcoins from one person to another. Everyone who has adopted Bitcoin has implicitly consented to that use of their own resources. Everyone who's running Bitcoin is committing their computer's resources toward this one purpose. And anything that's not within that purpose is necessarily spam. Simple, maybe not at a subjective level, because, you know, like someone comes up with some new idea, you or I could say, yeah, sure, we want to participate in that. But not everybody using Bitcoin is consenting to that new idea. So that's why it's, when you look at the big picture, it's all would all be spam unless you do it in a certain way. There are ways to have side chains where you can add these new things.
Sure.
And then only people who actually opt in are burdened by them.
So what do you say to folks who say, well, you know, it's going to be an OpReturn, we'll make it unlimited. You know, you don't have to store it if you want. It's totally up to you to store it if you want. We'll just remove the limit and we'll go ahead. Is that a satisfactory answer to you, or is it enabling something that you don't like? What's our interpretation of this?
It's not just about storage. Every node has to download everything that's in the main blockchain and process it, whether it discards it or not. To avoid that, you have to have a side chain. And that's, you know, all possible. That's been developed technology for nearly a decade now. The only reason that these spammers are putting it in OpReturn or inscriptions or whatnot, the only reason is to impose it and force it on people who do not want to have anything to do with it.
And so what does the downstream consequence look like if your worst fears happen and OpReturn is unlocked and we can throw whatever we want in it? From a technical perspective, from a cultural perspective, what's your apprehension for what happens a day after that and what happens a year or 2 years after that? What's your kind of vision for this is what we want or don't want?
Well, as I was mentioning earlier, when 0.9 added the OpReturn at all, there was a limit of 40 bytes on it. Bitcoin Core eventually increased it up to 80, but there was the explicit mention that this is not meant to be used. This is just a way to minimize the damage of people who are ignoring the design of Bitcoin and spamming anyway. Yet, in hindsight, we see that that was taken as a kind of endorsement, despite explicitly saying that it wasn't. It was taken as an endorsement. People treat it as something that they're entitled to. You've got newer developers who treat it as something that's useful for storing backups of people's data and forcing everyone else using Bitcoin to store their backups for them instead of actually keeping their own backups. And so this is, as much as you might say explicitly, okay, we're going to have an unlimited OpReturn, but don't use it, that's not going to happen. People are going to treat it as if it's something approved, as if it's something that's supported and intended, and that Bitcoin does not have the capacity to do too much at once. Even the 1 megabyte blocks that we had 8 years ago, it turns out that was even too large. And the more spam there is in a block, the larger it can get.
What I think is so interesting is that you oftentimes have folks that have been in the protocol for so long that you have not only seen the cultural or the technical development of the protocol, but you've also seen the cultural development of the protocol. Was it odd for you to meet somebody like Bob who kind of understood the principles that you were adhering to? Do you find lots of people like that? How do you have a sense of this is going to be a good partnership or a good relationship? Because Bob, I don't know if you come from spending your time in the programmatic trenches. It's interesting to me that you align in such a core way on your vision of what Bitcoin is, but you're coming at it from pretty radically different perspectives, very different histories.
I think there's a lot of Bitcoiners out there, actually. I don't know, I don't think I even met you until, like, we were ready to launch, basically.
Almost at the launch point, at least on a formal basis, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that there's a misnomer. I actually got into a little Twitter spat with somebody, imagine that, that was questioning my technical credentials and my ability to have an opinion in this topic.
I think I saw that one.
And it would be, I don't want to get into a detailed history of my background, or come off as saying, I am the be all end all. I'm not. If we're trying to decide what the best method to create quantum resistant addresses is, I'm not the best guy. That's not me. But I think I do have a pretty good technical grasp. I do have a degree in computer science, by the way. I spent early parts of my career coding, compiler design, OS design, so I have some capabilities, but I haven't been involved in Bitcoin coding. And I think one of the interesting things is that what I found from not only this one particular individual, but some others, is that I think there's this perception that if you haven't contributed to Bitcoin Core, if you haven't coded, if you haven't been participating in that circle, that you don't have an opinion or a voice of note. And earlier when you asked me the first question, one of the things I said is there's a lack of understanding of process or governance in this whole ecosystem. One of the things I've said is basically everybody's here most likely because they're a Bitcoiner, at least at some level. But when you bought your first Bitcoin, if you ran your first mining machine, there's not some owner's manual that says, welcome to the family, and here's, if you want to get involved and you want to have a voice, here's the way it goes. I'm still learning even to this day, and what I'm learning is, like, if you're not inside the GitHub, if you're not on the Bitcoin dev mailing list and interacting there, then from the perspective of those groups, at least my perception is, you're of no value. You have no say in it. Yet a lot of the people, for instance, in this room, there's probably very few other than Luke that have ever written code or reviewed code or been part of that process. But this room probably represents tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars invested in Bitcoin, maybe more than that. A whole bunch invested in infrastructure. There are people like me, for instance. I have a project I mentioned before, doing a block space derivative. I have another project where we're designing an ASIC, and it's important that we understand at a minimum what's happening, what direction that Core wants to go, if they even speak for Bitcoin. And that there be an adequate amount of time to provide feedback and change direction if there really is a change. It's to my perspective, it's a very, very broken process. It is one that's more divisive than unifying at the greater community. Maybe you can even speak to this, Luke. I think we live in a very different world. The Bitcoin of, let's say, 2015. And the people participating were the typical person, very different than the typical person today. But I don't think there's been any change in this process.
There's this subtext, this kind of underlying current, which I think is really interesting and shouldn't be forgotten, which is that in an exponentially growing cultural system, somebody can show up tomorrow and dump $1 billion into Bitcoin or $2 billion into Bitcoin, and that will do something to the price or the market cap. There's this thing that can scale exponentially but happens much more slowly, which is the education of the user base. And there's this consistent requirement that you always have to go back and teach people first where we are, but also to some extent, how the heck did we get here? Because it's not just, we're not just looking at avatars and well, a lot of times we're looking at avatars and memes. I've shared a few myself and I'm guilty of having received some, but there's history there. There's a reason that these people have been working in the space for so long. I'm curious what you feel is most important for you to teach or to share with the broader community, maybe the newer community, the folks who are just getting in and just learning about Bitcoin, who might see an avatar, see you on Twitter, see somebody sending something your way, but not necessarily know the experience, the background, or the passion that you have for the space that we're in. So what is critical to teach the people that are the new entrants now?
Probably the responsibility of being a participant in Bitcoin. Bob mentioned that he feels like he was denied a voice, and the irony there is that when it comes to policy, it's the nodes, it's the miners who make that decision. It isn't even the developer's place to be making any decisions in that regard. But miners, individual nodes, everyone has to have some involvement in actually deciding the direction of Bitcoin. It can't just be left to a central entity. We're supposed to be a decentralized network. So you can't just take a passive role and just blindly upgrade without paying any attention to what may or may not have changed. And everyone needs to use their own node. If people don't use their own node, it just basically turns Bitcoin into another fiat currency, but worse because there's no accountability.
So there is really more responsibility than just putting your money in the bank. Let Chase deal with it. If you're going to be a Bitcoiner, you better take some time to actually learn what the heck you're doing if you're running a node and you're self-custodying. What do you say, Bob?
Well, it's interesting. I had this kind of epiphany recently that I think the word hodl has a certain negative to it, and that's that it perpetuates this attitude that you just buy Bitcoin and hold it and do nothing and you'll get rich. And I think what Luke is saying is paramount to it. No, it's participatory, and I think if you don't participate, you're basically being selfish, by the way, too. You're probably hurting yourself, but you're also being selfish that, you've invested in this thing and you're going to just expect everybody else to do the work. It's not like buying a stock in a company. When you buy a stock in a company, you buy shares and you expect the management team to act on your behalf and do the best thing. Bitcoin isn't that way. I'll reiterate, Bitcoin is participatory. That's a really, really important thing. So I do agree with Luke, but I think we also, have to remember how young we are. I believe Bitcoin is money for the next 1,000 years, and that the only way it gets screwed up is if we screw it up. And so when I see things happen like has happened over the last week or so, what I see is a group of people, even if all the intentions are pure and good and for the best of Bitcoin, that I can't for the life of me figure out what's the rush. It just seems that we're at a point in the development of Bitcoin where, we have to take our time and we have to do the right things. Again, nobody could speak to it better than Luke, but I think when SegWit was implemented, that the surprise that it suddenly became a mechanism for spam to enter the chain at a discounted rate was not part of the plan. And so I don't know. I don't think this change probably has that sort of impact. I think it has more to do with, again, reducing user flexibility and miner flexibility. But who knows? I don't know.
I'm glad that you brought up the historical aspect about this, because you've obviously had massive experience with SegWit, the fork wars, everything leading up to that. Do you hear echoes of that in the current conversation? Does it seem like Groundhog Day to you? It's the same thing all over again? Or is this something very different to you? Are there any reflections between those two historical moments, what we had then and what we have now?
Yeah, I would say there's definitely a lot of similarities. But I wouldn't say it's exactly the same as either.
What do you notice? Is it just that the community has changed? It's just a different technical problem that's occurring?
There's a possibility the community's changed. Hopefully not too much for the worse. Back with SegWit, we relied on the community being activist and running the UASF client to get SegWit activated, despite the miners. At the time, the miners were the attackers. This time, it may be that they have to run Bitcoin nuts until Bitcoin Core gets its act together. Hopefully, something like that eventually follows through.
It's hard to say.
Yeah,
History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
It's easy to look at things in hindsight, and not so easy to look forward.
That's right. I mean, I won't ask you what you think the future will hold then. Bob, what do you say?
But here's the thing. I said it earlier. You know, these kind of things, whether they're Bitcoin related or just history related, they can be points in time in which people kind of break out of their coma and suddenly realize they do have to participate. That if they feel wronged, like I feel wronged personally, so I'm vocal, right? And I think that what is happening is not only bad for me, but it's bad for Bitcoin, you know. And I do want to say one thing, you know, my company, Barefoot Mining, we have a mantra that we only do things that are best for Bitcoin, and then decide if they're best for us. And I'll say that being part of Ocean, you know, Luke has that in the charter of Ocean too. I don't remember the exact words, Luke, but it's basically in the charter of Ocean, you know. And now other people may disagree whether or not what we're doing is the best thing for Bitcoin, but the Ocean team, at least, is coming from the spirit of doing the best thing for Bitcoin, above and beyond trying to make money.
I'd love to dive into that a little bit more around how you make business decisions, because when you look at the current pool landscape, the conversation around centralization had not reached a fever pitch until you started to raise it. And it was very interesting because if you look back into the history of Bitcoin, it's not like it's obtuse. You can go to the Bitcoin Talk forum and you can see Slush launching his first pool and saying, hey, we're having a problem. The CPU miners aren't hitting blocks anymore. What if we loop together? And he says in no uncertain terms in his posting on the Bitcoin Talk forums, you're going to have to trust me to keep an eye on these share allocations, and you're going to have to trust me to send you the work. It's always funny to look back and to say, you could have never imagined from what he had launched initially as kind of this quirky, creative, technical solution that was solving a problem for smaller miners. In that was the seed of what we saw years and years gone by, which is this growing censorship risk, the lack of template control amongst individual actors. And what you did so well is you raised the question, you brought it right to the surface, and you said, hey, you think you've been mining, sort of the little matrix moment. You think that's hash you're doing right now? That's kind of what you did. And then what immediately followed was people said, oh, I actually don't understand what we're doing. Oh, I've got 10 megawatts and I have no idea what my machines are actually doing under the hood. How do you dovetail this growing, this exploding business ecosystem with the requirement to go to people and say, oh, no, you actually have to be a good steward of the chain too. You have to actually care about the oceans that you're fishing in, so to speak. No pun intended, but it's a good one. I'll take credit for it.
Yeah, I spent the first decade of working on Bitcoin as kind of just an independent developer, just no company involvement necessarily. And when I started Ocean, my thought wasn't so much the goal was to start a new company, a new business, as much as it was Bitcoin needs this. So Ocean particularly is focused on solving a problem for Bitcoin more than it is a traditional business.
Was that a good investor pitch for you, Bob?
Well, like I said, I was already sold when I could create my templates. That's all I needed to hear. I think the majority of the hash rate in the mining network today is represented by people who come from a relatively fiat mindset. And they look at it from the perspective of, I want to mine as much as possible, give me the fattest blocks with the biggest fees. And I think it's a very myopic perspective, because if it is the pervasive attitude for an extended period of time, we lose the ecosystem. So it's like, I'll come up with a bad example, I'm sure. A company making chemicals could probably make more money by dumping a bunch of shit into the river instead of disposing of it properly, right? I mean, I think that, it's something like that. Or a movie company could make a lot more money. Sony Pictures would make more money if they just did all porn, right? I think it's a terrible attitude because it goes against the grain. But I also think, as I mentioned earlier, what happens is, I use the term abdication. What's happened is the hashers, Marshall and I think reached on the term zombie hashers. So you were waiting for me to get in, right? The zombie hashers, they've given up the power of the thing that I believe will actually be their meal ticket in the long run, which is creating block space and being a custodian of that block space. So I think it's a stupid move in the long run. But if they keep perpetuating that attitude, give all the powers to the pools, well, then a couple pools like Foundry or Pool will be the ones that get to bear the fruits of that.
We don't even have to speculate at this point. After 2 years of the ordinals inscription spam, we see
Fair enough.
when the spam attack stops, there's almost no activity left on the chain.
Yeah, fair enough. Yep, agreed.
I would love to have a couple of questions come through, but first, you're all chomping at the bit. Can we give a huge round of applause to Luke and Bob?